Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Michael Tremblay,
And I'm Caleb Ontiveros.
and today we're going to be talking about effective altruism. Um, some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might not, but I think it's a really cool modern philosophical movement, and we're going to look at it as through the lens of a life philosophy. So if you think of Stoicism as a philosophy of life, skepticism, existentialism, what would it mean to think of effective altruism as a philosophy of life? What does that entail? What does that commit you to? And then maybe looking at at the end, some contrasts, compare and contrasts with Stoicism, just to draw out some of the implications there. Before we jump into what is effective altruism, any other context you wanted to give, Caleb?
I think one way to think about effective altruism is it's as a philosophical movement, but also a social and political one. And I would say it's
Hmm.
not especially large, but it has an outsized impact for its size, and perhaps like a few other movements like that is worth thinking about for that reason. Or maybe we'll focus a little less on the social matters, but as you say, think about it from the standpoint of a philosophy of life. And I think, in a sense, one could be an effective altruist and a Stoic at the same time. They're not necessarily
Hmm.
exclusive. There is a way of sketching out effective altruism and Stoicism where they do become into conflict, perhaps in a similar way where you can, in a sense, be a Christian and a Stoic, but in another sense, fundamentally, you can't be. So I think that's what we're going to be drawing upon. And I should say, effective altruism is something I've thought about a lot. I thought about it before I encountered Stoicism. Probably first started thinking about the issue in 2011, and have been involved in a variety of different effective altruist groups, though am less so now. So
Um,
it is something I've thought about a lot. I should say I have a vested interest in history and effective altruism, but Michael's coming at it from a more impartial. Uh,
Impartial and maybe a bit more of a layman territory here. You're the expert. You can sense check. I prepared these notes, but happy for you to push back. And I don't want to front load too much because I don't want to leave the suspense if people aren't familiar with it as a movement. But it's one that I've also thought was quite interesting. We're kind of every once in a while you encounter something that appeals to your philosophical intuitions. Maybe that's not a great reason for prioritizing over another philosophical school, but this is one of those for me. Like Stoicism, this is one that I thought, oh, that's really interesting. This is getting at something important. But didn't get involved in the movement the same way you did.
mhm.
Um, so let's jump into it. Just to want to at least put a definition on the table so we can talk about those other points with some context. So what is effective altruism? So I took this straight from the Effective Altruism website. It says effective altruism is a project that aims to find the best ways to help others and put them into practice. So I think of it as it has both this has a this is also from the website, but it has this research component, which is that it aims to find the most pressing problems. So there's this like kind of epistemological position, which is like we need to correctly find the biggest problems and the best solutions to them. And then there's almost like an ethical or behavioral component, which is, and then we need to collectively act in a way that solves those problems as effectively as possible. And uses those findings, what we've discovered, and measured correctly to do good. As the website goes on to say, this project matters because while many attempts to do good fail, some are enormously effective. For instance, some charities help 100 or even 1,000 times as many people as others when given the same amount of resources. This means that by thinking carefully about the best ways to help, we can do far more to tackle the world's biggest problems. So that's effective altruism, I think, in its fulsome way of framing it. So it's got that, yeah, again, that factual component. What are the biggest problems that humans have the most a degree of influence over, or the most capacity to solve? And then that practical behavioral question of how do we then organize ourselves and act to then solve those problems. So it places an emphasis on the what and the how in that way. Um, And then I wanted to jump to what does that mean as a philosophy of life? What are some of its key characteristics as a philosophy of life? But
Mhm.
anything else you want to give on that definition?
Well, just to maybe one way to make this definition slightly more philosophically concrete. One of the first effective altruist type papers, at least as a modern movement, was by a fellow named Peter Singer. He wrote a paper called On Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And it was essentially about how you can, how it essentially argued that people in developed, affluent nations have a moral duty to give to charity, and one that's comparable to the moral duty one has to save a drowning child. And I think there's a you can see how that sort of is related to effective altruism, where it's this idea of thinking about how to do the most good, not necessarily taking sort of like common sense ethics as the end all be all, but thinking about abstractly, if you want to do the most good, what does that mean? That might mean you start prioritizing the interests of people far away from you. That might mean not necessarily taking on a career that's seen as altruistic, but doing the most effective thing and this sort of thing. So that's just maybe one way to sketch it out a little bit more. I know we'll keep on doing that, but
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Give some color to it. So that's that famous thought experiment, Peter Singer's famous thought experiment, where our ethical intuitions tell us if we were walking by a pond or some sort of shallow body of water and a child was drowning, and we were like, I could save that child, but I would get my new Nike shoes, my new $500 beautiful Nike shoes, dirty. So I'm not going to save them. I'm going to let them drown. Our kind of ethical intuition is there's something really wrong there. And so the logical conclusion to that is that if I have $500 of disposable income and I can donate that to a developing nation or an effective charity elsewhere in the world and save a life, then not doing that is just as bad as allowing the child to drown. And then, there's these common counter arguments that like, well, are you saying we should give away all our money and not have anything? And I think people take different approaches to this, but one is just a common sense approach that I think Peter Singer takes, which is, well, you should at least do things that would not have a major negative impact on your life. And many people in developed nations have the kind of disposable income that losing $1,000, $2,000 would not have a significant major negative impact on your life. For some people that would. That's your rent and your groceries. But for many people in a country like the United States, which we're both in, losing $2,000 is inconsequential, but has a major impact for other people. And so I also viewed it as this kind of flipping when I first learned about it, as you view charity as this like, well, there's nothing wrong with not donating, but if you donate, you're a great person. And there's this flip. Peter Singer almost flips it in this other way where it's like, well, if you don't donate and you have the capacity to do so without it harming the quality of your life, that's actually a major flaw or a major issue. And then you might know more about these movements now, but as you pointed out, so then the implication of that is that, if you're trying to do the most good, you're trying to be as effective as possible. It probably means looking for these effective charities or effective movements, being impartial about what is effective. So not, a lot of the time I think a common effective altruist criticism would be that we sometimes do good because we want to feel good. So we do the good things that make us feel the best about ourselves. I don't know if effective altruism takes this argument, but I would present this argument. So maybe we help people in our community, even though they don't need as much help, because it makes us look good in the community. It showers us with praise. There's this way of kind of being displaying. Look at how much I helped this person at school or my neighbor. Where the effective altruist would more take the stance of, okay, well, but who are the people in the world that would actually benefit from your money or your time? And it's often not the ones that make us kind of feel the best. And that can kind of be I take that as the what part, that kind of epistemological question. We often make mistaken judgments about the best place to put our time, money, effort to make a good result. But with that framing in mind, I'll go through my framework of, I think, what effective altruism is committed to as a philosophy of life. I think first, so if we think about these examples we've talked about, first, it's broadly consequentialist. So its goal is to produce the best aggregate outcomes. So to do the most possible good. So if when we think about Stoicism, we think about it as a philosophy of life, it makes a claim about what it is to be a great person. For Stoicism, that's to live with virtue. I think for effective altruism, it's to have lived a good life is to have produced the most benefit for humanity, or at least a sizable benefit for humanity, given the situation you were born into. So if you're in a position to do a lot of good with a relative little harm to yourself, you're born into a position of a lot of charity or in a developed nation, then to be a good person is to have made good on that potential, to have maximized that potential in terms of consequences. So if you donate your money to an ineffective charity and nothing really happens, well, you don't get a free pass. You have to also be discerning about where that help is actually, discerning about which actions are actually helpful and bring them the most beneficial consequences. I think that's the effective part, that consequentialism. And then the altruist part is that it's incredibly cosmopolitan. So all people in effective altruism are seen as relatively equal. We were talking about this a bit, Caleb. I think it'd go too far to say they're absolutely equal, but they're relatively equal. So I should care about the suffering of a child in Africa, maybe not as much as my own child, but as much as any child I do not know. Just because the child is in Africa and I've never been to Africa doesn't mean I should place them below, I would say children closer by or things that I have some sort of sentimental attachment to. That's kind of a bit of a poor reason. I've made my community too small. I want to be cosmopolitan in that community. We can't use distance as an excuse for less distance, or familiarity as an excuse for less care. So as a philosophy of life, you need to be consequentialist. So try to maximize good. You need to be cosmopolitan. So you extend the sphere of whose good matters really broad. And one thing that the effective altruists do is they extend that, they sometimes don't even stop at cosmopolitanism. So it's really popular in these movements. Peter Singer talks a lot about animal welfare. I haven't read his books on animal ethics, but I know that's something that he's an important member of that movement. Will McCaskill, who's an important member of effective altruism, also has a book called What We Owe the Future, which is about our obligations to future generations. So it's again, this really expansive view of who and what matters. It includes not just the world, but maybe non-human animals, maybe future generations. And then the last point, and I'll pass it back to you, Caleb, is that I think when I think about, if I had to distill, if you say Stoicism is about virtue, cynicism is about freedom. If I had to distill effective altruism to one idea, like one sentence as a way of a philosophy, as a way of life, I would say it's internal consistency. So it's this idea to put your money where your mouth is. If you claim humans matter, which most of us would claim, how would you live in a way that's internally consistent to that claim? What does it mean to actually follow through on the belief that humans matter? If you care about animal welfare, what does it mean to follow through on those ideas? And maybe that means I actually have an obligation to set up the world to be productive and healthy for future generations, because those future generations are humans. And I'm not going to make this mistake just because, I'm not attached to people that don't exist yet, or I don't have this kind of emotional attachment to people far away from me. So that I think is if I had to put it into a sentence, that's the way that I would think about it. And so that means, we don't just debate these topics. A major aspect of effective altruism is the donation of a portion of your income consistently to charity. We have to again spend our time and our money supporting these things. And then we also just don't dedicate our lives to helping people. I've spoken about this before, but the effective part, we don't just help people in a way that makes us feel good. We think really coherently and strategically about the ways to be the most helpful, to help the
Mhm.
most people as effectively as possible. Um, yeah, I think about this. When I think about this, I think about sometimes there's this criticism. I watch a lot of true crime, and sometimes there's this criticism around some small girl will go missing, and then all the helicopters will be out, and they'll be like, the entire police force will be combing the forest to try to because it's like a little girl that's missing. And I think the effective altruism is this kind of criticism of that kind of inconsistency, where you spend so much resources because it's like a little girl, but there are people starving on the streets. There's famine in other countries, and we're not kind of giving that consistency. And it's not a kind of like whataboutism. It's the effective altruist also then goes, and then I will then go and help those causes. I will then go and put my money where my mouth is there. See, a bit of a brain dump there, but what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's a useful way to construe effective altruism. It's, as you say, broadly consequentialist in terms of prioritizing the consequences of our actions and thinking about perhaps ranking different problems, actions, and such by their scale. It's cosmopolitan. You could say it's egalitarian, would be another way to put it. Like you shouldn't have or at least not without significant justification, you shouldn't be that partial to, you know, some people because they happen to be closer to you, because they happen to be members of the same species and such. And that does lead to this sort of expansive view of who and what matters. Perhaps one way to see it as a philosophy of life is to take the extreme case, like where an effective altruist is close to a moral saint. They organize their life around the principle of how can I do the most good, and they obsess over that in any decision they make. And I think it's fair to say that might be a target for many effective altruists, but not one they achieve in the same way perhaps a sage is a target for the Stoic, or
Mm-hmm.
Jesus might be a target for a Christian. But you can think of effective altruism as a life philosophy. That is the organizing principle. How do I do a significant amount of good in my life? And that requires thinking about what am I capable of? What are the causes that are the most good? And and then of course, action. Doing the actions, becoming the kind of person who does the most good. So I think that's one way to perhaps think about it. Is you just have like that. Perhaps the altruism, effective altruism, becomes an organizing principle of your life. That's the life philosophy, and it should be understood as you described it, with these consequentialist, egalitarian aspects to it.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. If you adopt, what does it mean to adopt as a philosophy of life? Because the same way somebody can take a Stoic tool, we talk about this metaphor, and put the tool in their tool belt, and they can pull out the dichotomy of control when they're stressed about, their business deal. That doesn't make them a Stoic, not a deep Stoic. The same way if I'm the kind of person who's making a donation and I do some research into where my donation is going and pick one that's more effective than another, it doesn't make me an effective altruist. What it would be to live as a philosophy of life is to organize your life around, given the position I was born into, how do I maximize the good that I do with these consequentialist and egalitarian positions, as we already talked about. Yeah, I think that's bang on. And so that's the next part I have in these notes here, is like how to actually be an effective altruist, which means what would it look like to organize your life around these principles, as we just mentioned. Many different ways to do this, but like one is this concept of 80,000 hours and a high impact career. So something the effective altruist movement argues for is that, look, if we want to maximize our positive impact in the world, this is probably best achieved by how we direct our labor. instead of these vague commitments of being kind or being helpful. So we have 80,000 working hours over a life, and we should strategize how to best use those hours to help others. So maybe you become the head of a charity or work in policy. Maybe the one thing they argue for as well is that maybe it's something, as you said previously, that doesn't even look appealing. Like maybe you just become, because you have a certain set of skills, you become a very high earning corporate lawyer. And there's nothing charitable about your work, but what you do is you make obscene amounts of money and you earmark 20% of that, 25%, whatever amount, for charity. And then, instead of you being an ineffective member of a movement that doesn't maximize your potential, you maximize your talents into a high earning position, and then you donate that money towards a group of people who are more specialized in actually then using that money to carry out good and to do good. So it's kind of like, I guess I'm keep thinking about these hero analogies. It's kind of like this criticism of Batman, right? It would be like, I just made this up. This is not an effective altruism thing, but it would be like if Batman really wanted to do good, instead of being this like selfish billionaire that then goes and does some vigilantism justice and he feels good and he's like, I'm a hero, he would really, cut out the man in the cape stuff, focus on what he's good at, which is like the accumulation of capital, and then distribute that to the most effective charities possible. That would be what Batman would look like as an effective altruist. And so another way to live your life like that. So one is like how you think about your career and your labor. Another way is the identification and support of high impact charities. So having a good knowledge base of what are the biggest problems in the world right now that humans have the most capacity to solve. What are the organizations that are most effectively solving that? The easy example is think of something like malaria in Africa or something like this, which is we understand how to solve it. We have the technology to prevent these cases, but we just don't have the capital to do so. And so identify some of these and redirect your money towards that when you're in a position to do so. So I think that's another one. If you were an effective altruist, then you have a clear sense of where your excess money should be going. And then I think the third way to live that, which these other ones hit on, but really a science-based understanding of the good. So I think what unifies all these different ways of being an effective altruist is this really clear focus on effective. It's not about dedicating your time, but thinking really critically about the how, problems that are on a large scale that we have a strong ability to influence that no one is targeting. So when we allow factory farming to exist, for example, that's like an animal welfare argument, which is something that we have alternatives to this that's in our control. We have mechanisms of addressing that. That might be an example of, but just examples like this of large scale solutions that are not based on, again, what feels good, but what is most effective. Thoughts on these?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of discussion in the effective altruist community, and perhaps there are critics on what the most effective ways to live are, or the most effective things to do are in terms of causes, whether it's global development, pandemic preparedness, improving the government institutions, AI safety, animal welfare. There's an important list. I think that's worth a very important list that's worth thinking about. But then once you think about causes, of course, they're the actual action. They're the actions in question. What actually promotes economic development, or what is the most effective ways to improve institutions and so on. So there's certainly a lot to say there. I suppose the main theme to draw out from this is that I think perhaps in a sense, many people of different life philosophies can take a scientific approach to doing good, take this sort of empirical approach to doing good, and they may even think they are doing that already without effective altruism. It's almost like the totalizing approach of effective altruism that makes it unique. So if you're thinking about a career, then you think about what's the best career I can take. If you're thinking about what to study, then you're thinking about these in terms of an altruistic lens, as opposed to perhaps just thinking about it in terms of, my personal fit, or trying to, I don't know, find my passion, achieve my dreams, or something like that. Whatever other heuristic you might have.
Yeah, I think that's right. So instead of, that's the tool is, well, I know this person, like somebody might do the tool, which is I know I'm going to donate some money. I'm going to pick the most effective charity to donate to. That's like one aspect of the lens. But it's not really a philosophy of life at this point. If you were to live a philosophy of life at this point, putting these together, you'd have decided a high impact career, impact being judged by your capacity to do good. You would have identified the charities or other mechanisms by which to do the most good. So if I'm going to get a high paying career, I can donate money here. If I'm doing a high impact job, it's because I'm participating in these charities or otherwise, economic development, um, pandemic preparedness. These examples you were mentioning, and I think that kind of comes back to the Stoic example of like, what are you actually good at as well? So instead of, as you were saying, instead of, well, this is what I'm most passionate about, or this is what I enjoy, it's like, no, what do you have a particular talent for? And what can that talent do to maximize the benefit of other people? Um, and then that's easy to say in the abstract, but then I think that when you actually live that science-based understanding of doing good was really hard. You need to be like really honest with yourself and not allow something to become a kind of a pet project or a passion project. Like, what does it mean to genuinely continually update your frame of reference for what does the most good? And maybe it's not, maybe it's not so silly as like everybody's doing the second or third most good is terrible. Like I'm sure, as you said, there's probably an important list of 5 to 10 things that would qualify, but being willing to update that list if new information comes out, being willing to change that frame of reference, and not just, I would assume it would be very tempting to emotionally invest in a cause and get really bought into it, and then be really resistant to evidence that maybe it's not as effective as you thought it was, or maybe it wasn't actually helpful. And it would take quite a lot of internal character to consistently update that frame of reference. I know that's a very challenging part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think maybe that's another. I think that's just a core component of effectiveness, is almost applying these kinds of mindsets people have in other domains. People talk about, the importance of pursuing the truth, not lying to yourself when you're creating a business, or when you're trying to discover, underlying facts of reality as a scientist. It's sort of taking that truth seeking mindset to, thinking about these questions of picking the cause you want to promote, thinking through what is, making the world a better place actually look like. What does that mean? And being willing to change your mind if you realize there's a better account.
Yeah. Or being willing to do something boring and not sexy as well, which I think is challenging. I think it's really easy to do the right thing. This is kind of Aristotle's position. Aristotle's position is like, habituate yourself so doing the right thing is fun and feels good. I think it's really easy to do the right thing if it's very cool. It's harder to do the right thing if it's either unpopular or maybe even worse, just like people are just totally apathetic to it. And so going back to that superhero example, I think these are funny and they're helpful for me. We've talked about before in this example, in this podcast, there's a criticism of utilitarianism that is basically something like, well, if utilitarianism was true and Superman existed, Superman was a real person, well, then he'd have to spend his entire life just like pushing a turbine that generated renewable energy for people, something like this. Like, if utilitarianism is true, then being kind of like a hero or a good person doesn't look like going off and doing these like really meaningful, personally fulfilling tasks. It might look like just like boringly churning out renewable energy for half the world which Superman could do if he could, or if the Flash could do. And I think the effective altruists just kind of bite the bullet on that one. I mean, maybe they say, well, yeah, maybe he does it like 40 hours a week. Like we leave time for people to be people,
Mm-hmm.
but insofar as Superman can do that without it becoming a terrible part, like without it becoming a life ruining component of his life, then yeah, then Superman should zoom out, think about the best thing his superpowers could do. And it's probably not, tying up bank robbers. It's probably something that's a lot less sexy and a lot less cool. I think that's fun. I think that's fun that they bite the bullet on that. Do you agree with that?
That agree with it. This is too demanding objection. They mostly just bite the bullet on it. Agree with that in particular.
Yeah, I mean both that they bite the bullet on the too demanding. I'm not sure if it is the too demanding objective because our objection. I guess there's two parts to that. The too demanding objection is something like the kind of life this asks you to live is like not feasible or it's too
Mm-hmm.
demanding. But there's this other, I think, this kind of virtue ethic objection where there's like an intuition that Superman going out saving people and helping people seems more courageous and heroic and like a better person intuitively than the Superman who's just like pushing, you know, churning something that generates energy for people. And that's the kind of virtue ethic versus consequentialist argument. And it's a criticism of consequentialism in that that doesn't seem like the best way to live. If you take it to its logical conclusion, it seems like it produces people that aren't, courageous, kind people. They're just these kind of maximizers, like kind of like these logistic maximization calculators. And I think effective altruism bites the bullet on that and says, well, if Superman was real, then yeah, then he would be a worse person if he prioritized the kind of good that was ineffective by going around saving people, flying around Manhattan equivalent. And what he should actually do is figure out what might actually be the best thing to do for his powers might actually be something that's like not very heroic, is a bit more boring, but that would be what he would be morally obligated to do. And it would be a moral failing to not do that, which I guess can become too demanding if you're asking him to do it,
Sure,
80,
I got
80
you.
hours a week, but
I got
not
you.
40.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose I understand. It's sort of it reminds me of Watchmen, and there's the Ozymandias character who do you know Watchmen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, anyway,
We should probably explain it for.
maybe I want to explain it because we're running. Well, maybe let's see. How can I do this quickly? There's a Watchmen is sort of a different take on superheroes, and one way to interpret the book is different characters represent different forms of ethics, and there's a utilitarian character, Ozymandias, who is a superhero, but sort of you learn exercises his powers by, in his view, engaging in mass deception in order to prevent a nuclear holocaust. And that's his view of what his actions were. So there's a sense in which that it's not going around, beating up villains, which I think that character in particular calls schoolyard ethics. It's almost a kind of behind the scenes historical scheming, which I think there's a natural reading of that book where it's a criticism of utilitarianism, but I think that's at least closer to the effective altruist reading of a superhero, where a superhero would be doing something creative, and that is thinking like an effective altruist. And it's not I think there's a version of that is a criticism of effective altruism, but it's not necessarily a criticism, and perhaps can be praise of the philosophy as well.
Yeah. And I think that's okay. Like I think if that's coherent and consistent to me. That I mean, what it means to be a good person might be something a bit more boring than the traditional superhero. Is my takeaway from that, and I think that's a useful reframing. Great. Anything else to add on effective altruism as a philosophy of life before we get into some comparisons and differences with Stoicism?
No, let's jump into it.
Cool. So I think it's always useful to go back to, and this is primarily a Stoicism podcast, and it's always useful to go back to Stoicism just to draw out the implications of these different philosophies of life. So starting with things that are similar with Stoicism. So one is the cosmopolitan aspect of it. So the Stoics, they were pioneers in this idea of expanding our concern to all humans. All humans matter to Stoics. We're all citizens of the universe. I think the Stoics rely more on role ethics. We'll get into that in the differences, the disagreements, than maybe the effective altruist does. But there's definitely this idea of we should expand our concern beyond our immediate family, city, country. We should care about all humans, um, and in virtue of them being humans. The second thing is this idea of this privileging of reason. So I think in both movements, both philosophies of life, thinking, reason, and rationality should direct our behavior. So the Stoics, they're not interested in feeling moral, but being moral and actually doing good. I wouldn't say the Stoic is consequentialist in that what determines good is not the outcome, but what determines good is if you actually made the right choice, right? It's um, not about feeling good or feeling like a good person or being confident that you're kind. It's about actually being kind, and that you can fail to do that if you misunderstand a situation, if you misread the context. You can have done something you thought was courageous and it wasn't courageous. Basically the point is that you can be mistaken about ethical judgments, and so you need to be moral means really thinking things through, a certain degree of knowledge, I suppose, about for effective altruism what's actually effective, and for Stoicism what's actually virtuous. And then a third similarity, I think, is that emphasis on internal consistency. The Stoics had no time for hypocrisy. You got to put your money where your mouth is. If you commit to something, you got to live it, or at least attempt to become the kind of person who lives in accordance with it. And I think effective altruism is the same way, which is, um, at the end of the day, we're practicing this or following this school of thought to modify our behavior and to improve our behavior. And if we're not doing that, then our practice is failing.
Yeah, perhaps another similarity, I agree with that 100%. Another similarity is that both life philosophies are transformative. I think it's clear how Stoicism focuses on transforming who you are. But I think sometimes people hear about effective altruism and they think, oh, everyone, they're really trying to do good. And, effectiveness, maybe that's a coarse way to put it, but they're thinking, they just have different values about what's good, or, they're trying their best and so on. But the effective altruist framing on this is that, you come into the world not as an effective altruist, but with all these sort of normal human drives that are not focused on altruistic tendencies. When they are altruistic, perhaps they're not effective. So it does demand a kind of a personal transformation to move your attention to doing the most good, and perhaps that's underrated.
Yeah, I like that idea. Well, I guess here's one question with the transformative aspect. If I was Elon Musk and I donated $50 billion to a charity, am I now an effective altruist, or am I pretending to be an effective altruist? This would be my criticism of the idea of the effective or my counter to your argument, because Elon Musk would not be a stoic. If you're doing this to impress people, you'd not be a stoic. You're not, you're not doing it for the right reasons. Does effective altruism care about the right reasons? Is I guess my question. And if not, how transformative can it be?
Well, I think personally, if you're adopting it as a life philosophy, then it's transformative. And it might be a little bit of an issue where you can have someone who behaves in a stoic way, but do you identify them as a stoic? Maybe not. So
Mm-hmm.
there is that. And there's also the issue of evaluating character, even though that's not primary to the effective altruist focus. There is something to the idea that you want to do that because character is predictive of future actions, and
Hmm.
it does matter who you are because that's going to determine how much good you end up doing. So perhaps that's another variable where people, they can do things that were altruistic, that were effective, but that may be more of a matter of getting lucky, perhaps, or they
Yeah.
had some other purpose they were serving than doing that as an effective altruist.
I mean, I guess my criticism is just a criticism you could levy against any consequentialist school, which is that, people could accidentally do things that raise utility or something like that. It's really just like a virtue ethic objection to consequentialist schools. But your way of framing it is that, well, we still care about character because character tends to predict your capacity to be effective and altruistic in the future, or effective and altruistic through time. And so if you really want to adopt it as a life philosophy, um, you need to have that kind of transformative aspect of it. Um, yeah, I think I'm just wrestling with this idea of like virtue ethics versus consequentialism, and one of the things that virtue, yeah, just that sometimes in consequentialist thinking you're going to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, and sometimes that just happens. But as a philosophy of life, can't be for the wrong reasons. Otherwise, you're not living it as a philosophy of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do think there is some difference there, and perhaps it gets back to the objection where you're talking about uh, uh, Superman and sort of like the standard. Maybe there are some ways of doing good that don't develop positive character attributes, and it's always a little bit tricky to reason about this. But I do think one criticism of effective altruism, it's almost like a financialization of the good. You're thinking
Yeah,
about how do I promote the good abstractly. You think about questions of scale, contribution. You almost start talking like a venture capitalist when you're thinking about how to donate or this sort of thing, and then it becomes detached from ordinary moral concerns, and perhaps there's something essential to morality that resists this kind of financialization. I think that's just what most non-consequentialists will say. And insofar as you are thinking too abstractly, that's a con of effective altruism.
yeah. I think that hits on it. It becomes this kind of, can someone pay their way out of being a bad person because you've abstracted out to this financialization? I think there's something about the effective altruism where it has this kind of like relative aspect to it, which I like, where the kind of demands on lower income people are lower, less affluent people are lower than the demands on more affluent people. Like kind of the demands upon you kind of scale. Um, so it's not like the person who donates $1 million is better than the person who donates 10, even though one's made a larger impact, because it is like relative to you, your potential, your impact, um, your potential for impact. Um, yeah, so that resolves a little bit. That resolves another issue, but I'm jumping ahead to kind of criticisms. I got too excited. So moving to the next part, those are the agreements with Stoicism, cosmopolitanism, focus on reason, focus on internal consistency, so matching your beliefs to behavior, and then this transformative aspect. And then differences with Stoicism and criticisms. First is, I would say, is this extreme cosmopolitanism. This might be, I think it's certainly more cosmopolitan than Stoicism is. Um, so Stoicism, because of role ethics, I think still privileges your family to a large degree, your community to a large degree. And so it's tough because Stoicism was not around in a time where you could be effective in a developing nation. I mean, I don't know if we would use the term developing nation, but Stoicism wasn't around in a period where you could, properly understand the impact you could have on a country in a different part of the world. So maybe this is an unfair criticism, but certainly as they're written, the Stoics are less cosmopolitan than the effective altruists. There's this notion of thinking about, you know, the entire world as your all humans as part of your polis, your city. Um, but there wasn't this focus on, I would say, intervening in areas outside of your own domain. And I guess I've tried to soften that with maybe a knowledge claim, which is maybe just, you know, the Stoics knew you didn't have the knowledge to do that effectively, where you could make an impact with your brother, your neighbor, your family. So maybe that softens the objection slightly. Um, another objection is that it can be too demanding. So it's not psychologically realistic for most people. Um, this is a criticism that also gets levied against Stoicism. You know, this idea of knowledge or the sage is not achievable. Um, but if effective altruism taken to the extreme, to me, seems to be even more demanding than extreme Stoicism, because extreme Stoicism is walking around with knowledge and virtue, but effective altruism, I feel, if you took it to an extreme, that saint-like perspective would be almost this like no self, like you're doing everything for the impact it has on other people. And I don't know if that's, I have some sort of intuition that that's like a strange way to live when taken to an extreme, and not really a feasible way to live. So you're kind of always setting yourself up for failure. Again, maybe that always applies to Stoicism as well. And then a third one, we'll go back through these, but a third one is that maybe this comes back to the point you were living with the abstract, the financialization, or thinking about living well in terms of this calculation of benefits and harms. Maybe that's just not the right way to approach living, and that the question of how we should deal with other people is better handled by role ethics. One where our obligations differ quite substantially. You know, everybody's owed the same minimum amount of respect, but our obligations change quite substantially depending on the roles or identities that overlap or we share with other people. And that seems to me to be a more, I don't know, grounded or human way of dealing with that aspect of living well or philosophy of life. So those are the big picture. Got the cosmopolitanism, the demands, and then this kind of calculation benefits maximization approach that's maybe better handled by role ethics. What do you think about those?
Yeah, I do think maybe one way to put the difference between Stoicism on the cosmopolitan and effective altruism on the cosmopolitanism front is that Stoicism is what's sometimes called a rooted form of cosmopolitanism, where you have these different relations with people, and that is that's just essential to who you are. So you are a brother, parent, neighbor, in addition to just being a human being, in addition to being a fellow citizen. And in that way, you're it's not a pure sort of absolute utilitarian view on the world where everyone's treated equally in sort of a flat way, and you're just trying to distribute the good to everyone considered equally. Instead, you are thinking about who you happen to be, and I think this probably gets into that last difference as well. Thinking about those roles you have. Marcus Aurelius says, as a man, he's a citizen of the universe. As Marcus Aurelius, he's a Roman, and I think both of those things matter to the Stoic. Whereas perhaps I think with effective altruism, there's always this overarching question or question in the background, what does the most good? And that can really sort of overturn things or cause you to pivot in a way where maybe you don't end up prioritizing some ordinary roles as much as you should on other life philosophies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that phrase, rooted cosmopolitanism before. I really like that. That captures really well that idea of those Stoic circles, while still having that full obligation to all people.
Yeah, the too demanding objection. I think that's interesting. Perhaps the effective altruist move here is you try to aim at what's psychologically realistic. I think they can sort of take a leaf out of the Stoics book or whatever the phrase is and thinking about, what's up to you, what can you actually do? And in terms of just who different people are, focusing on doing good over the long term, some people are going to be able to dedicate their life to that. Others, they might take that as a significant part of their project, but just because of their makeup, what's possible, they might need more rest time, more kinds of focus on things that are not necessarily good. I think perhaps it's this sort of thing is perhaps easiest to think of outside of the moral context, where if you read a biography about, some famous politician or something of this sort, and you just see how dedicated they were to obtaining their own personal power, I think that's obviously something to those people's psychology that not a lot of people have, and perhaps isn't even possible for most people to, have that sort of, develop that sort of willingness to obtain power at whatever cost. And we probably say the same thing about doing good. And there's just going to be it is a demanding philosophy. There's no doubt about that. But there is, reality is a constraint, and effective altruists are certainly going to not deny that.
Well, I really like. I mean, I think that's a good response. That effectiveness, that realism, applying it also to yourself. If we look at our life over, we don't want to encourage burnout. When we talk about people being, you're the kind of person who's disposed, your talent is to become a heart surgeon, make a bunch of money, and donate a good chunk of that. We don't want to push everybody to become heart surgeons and they all burn out or they're not very good at it, or that's not everybody's aiming at the same kind of impact. And so that psychological, as you said, the psychological realism or realistic expectations, but some people are just going to be harder workers than others. Some people are going to be more productive than others. Some are more talented. And when you take that into account, then kind of your limit, the upper end of your limit, because Stoicism has that dichotomy of like everybody can achieve knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And effective altruism doesn't have to make that claim that everybody can be as effective.
Right.
Maybe the goal is for you to be relatively rather effective, but it doesn't have to make that claim that everybody's going to be 100% impactful all the time in the most effective ways. And when you remove that claim, which I think was probably just in my mind from studying so much Stoicism, thinking about Stoicism so much, they can just say, oh, no, it's fine. You just have to be pretty good compared to where you are. And then that demanding, as you said, it's still very demanding. It's not like it's transformative, and anything that's transformative is demanding, but it doesn't have to be unrealistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps another difference with Stoicism and effective altruism is that I see effective altruism as really rejecting status quo bias. And I think was touched on by our discussion of sort of common sense ethics. And if you look at the cause selection, it's perhaps not what would immediately come to mind for most people. Things like they were relatively early and thinking about pandemic preparedness, AI safety, thinking about, doing the most good as a matter of perhaps getting a career that pays quite a lot instead of a nonprofit type role or something of this sort. Peter Singer advocated people be more public about their donations, which I think rubs people the wrong way and is a sort of upset of normal norms, or can rub people the wrong way. It's an upset of normal norms because he thinks that would be more effective to build a culture where people celebrate people who donate a lot and donate well. Whereas I wouldn't say Stoics have a powerful, or of course Stoics can say the status quo is mistaken, but I think there's sort of, it's in role ethics, there's sort of a built-in reliance on tradition, on norms, and at least this idea that you really ought to have a good reason to upset a norm before you do so. And perhaps there is some more epistemic trust in what other people have reasoned or something like this. There's not, perhaps, I think Stoics would take a little bit more than just a consequentialist argument to decide, oh, it's a good thing for people to promote how much they give or something like this publicly, and maybe would default more to the status quo. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, at first I was thinking about it as a similarity with Stoicism because you got these Stoic paradoxes and you got these Stoics were known for these radical claims. But it's almost like the Stoics are radical in terms of ethics, in terms of what is good and bad, and then fairly status quo when it comes to how to actually behave towards your coworkers or your your family. As you said, you have a good reason. You have to have a good reason to break these rules. And then maybe I don't want to get too cheeky with this, but maybe the effective altruist is the other way, where they're kind of common sense about what matters, helping other people, minimizing pain, but then controversial in terms of how you go about doing that. And then really, which is like, you've got to give me a really good reason for following the status quo. Otherwise, I'm just going to do what science tells me is the most effective thing. Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's like we talked about this again. There's the what and the how. There's kind of in Stoicism, there's the discipline of desire, and then the discipline of action. It's really like Stoics. The controversy of Stoicism is really in that discipline of desire, but the discipline of action, you said, is rather status quo, actually, or at least leaves space for being status quo, where the effective altruist is much more radical, I guess, in how they go about doing it. Although maybe not necessarily radical in that if they do their job, hopefully these things won't be controversial in a while. Like they become less controversial. Like animal ethics or something becomes less controversial the more it gets discussed. But yeah, agreed with you in terms of not following the status quo unless they have a good reason to do so.
Yeah, cool. Makes sense.
Cool. Anything else? Any last words?
Well, I think there's maybe one thing that I always wrestle with is there's an effective altruist type challenge to Stoicism, which is that maybe Stoics should take as one of their roles this idea of beneficence, of doing the most good. And perhaps you don't adopt effective altruism as a life philosophy, but you should take seriously one of the your life projects just is doing the most good as you can. So I think that's sort of a challenge from the effective altruist. Should put at the feet of the Stoics. And I do think there is something compelling about the sort of financialization type objection to effective altruism, and that's this sort of downplaying of virtue ethics, other moral or other styles of thinking. And so perhaps in terms of objections, that's what I would to effective altruism, that's what I would leave it with.
Yeah, I mean, to take up your first point, I think that is something you can take up in the Stoic framework. Those virtues are multifaceted. Maybe a component of one of them to emphasize is that maximizing your good or leaning more into the cosmopolitan aspect of the ethics. And I think what I'm taking away from this conversation related to that point is that idea that we probably just exist we do exist in quite a significantly different world in terms of our access to information about what is effective and about our capacity to influence people across the world. And with those two things in mind, what changes how does that impact the actual commitments of cosmopolitanism for the Stoics? Probably leads more towards the beneficence. Is that the word you used?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably leans more towards that than how the ancient Stoics wrote about it.
Cool. Thanks for putting these together.
Great. Thanks, Caleb.
Awesome. See ya. Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. If you found this conversation useful, please give us a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you use, and share it with a friend. And I'd like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. Do check out his work at ancientlyre.com, and please get in touch with us at stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback or questions. Until next time.